welcome to the Culinary Time Machine, where we explore the evolution of cooking. Now, today's video is a little bit weird because today's video is kind of just a setting the stage for tomorrow's video. So what happened is I was filming the video for tomorrow and editing it, and I realized that I got very long-winded. I said, and I explained in a lot of detail some things that I think can be interesting to some people, and also may not be the most exhilarating subject matter necessarily. So for the video tomorrow, I'm going to do the originally as planned, exploring how cooking styles evolved throughout prehistory. In this video, I'm going to share how heat transfer occurs, like the 3 ways that heat transfer occurs, along with different types of cooking styles, and in my opinion, their prevalence in prehistory. So for the how heat transfers, there are 3 methods. Realistically, most times that you are cooking, or the heat is being transferred to your food in a combination of ways. However, there will probably be one that is more prevalent, and so in this video I kind of highlight examples that would showcase one method over the other 2 more. But just know that, in the reality of our physical world, heat transfer oftentimes takes place in a combination of ways, not just one method at a time. And then I'll get into the different cooking styles. That includes cooking with dry heat, cooking with moist heat, and frying food. So that is what you can look forward to in this video. And if you feel like you're pretty comfortable in thermodynamics and the basic styles of cooking, then be on the lookout for the video tomorrow, which will be the originally scheduled programming of how cooking styles evolved throughout prehistory. That video may be a little more interesting and engaging overall. All right, thank you guys so much. So when we talk about cooking, let's be clear about 3 types of cooking, okay? There's cooking through radiation, through conduction, and through convection. So radiation is more of that direct heat. So in today's equipment, you would see that through a toaster oven, or the broil function on your oven, right? So it is a direct passing of heat to food. So in prehistoric times, that would be like having your food right above the flames, so that the heat waves, as they are coming up, they are cooking that food. Convection heat is when there is movement of heat around your food. So an oven with a fan in it would be a contemporary version of convection cooking. Additionally, steaming, using a steamer, is an example of convection cooking. And lastly, conduction. Conduction cooking happens when there's direct contact between the food and a hot surface. So in contemporary means that would be a griddle, or most of the cooking that you are doing on your stove through pans. The prehistoric version of that would be putting food on a hot stone and cooking it that way. I kind of skipped over what convection cooking would have been in prehistoric times, because this one probably won't be as common as the other 2. If you think about that movement of heat to cook the food, so you could have your meat on a spit 3 feet or so away from the fire, and someone could be sitting there and fanning the flames to get the heat to move towards that. However, that's pretty inefficient, so it's probably pretty unlikely that would be a popular way to have cooked food. Convection could have also included putting hot stones in water for it to simmer and then adding food to cook it that way. However, you do need a vessel or some type of non-porous place to put that water and then put those hot stones, so that may not have been nearly as common as just like your straight cooking through radiation by having the food over an open fire. So we have like radiant heat, convection heat, conduction, but a very, very quick summary is radiation is direct heat waves cooking your food. Conduction is your food hitting, making direct contact with a hot surface, and convection is the movement of air or steam, etc., around your food to cook it. Okay, now in addition to those three forms of heat movement, we also have three methods of cooking: dry heat cooking, moist heat cooking, and cooking with a fat. So the dry heat cooking methods include roasting, baking, broiling, and grilling or griddling. And so if we look at these 5 dry heat cooking methods, roasting is going to be that, like, placing food over a fire, roasting. Baking should technically, the food should go through the baking process, a coagulation of proteins, gelatination of starch, evaporation of moisture, and so a crust formation around the outside. So really you're thinking like breads and cakes and such. Broiling, that is direct heat from above. Grilling is direct flame from below over a grate. So it's a little bit different than roasting because there's like a grate that is also helping to transfer that heat. And then griddling is direct contact with a full, like, flat surface, with a flat solid surface. Okay, so out of those, baking and broiling would have been the 2 least commonly seen cooking methods until we get later into human history. Broiling is going to be pretty difficult to do without specialized equipment created for it. I mean, if you really, really wanted to try to make it happen with like a fire, open pit fire, you could put a fairly flat hot stone in there and then use some sort of long tool so that you can grab that stone without using your hands because it will burn your fingers. So maybe if you have like an antler that in some way can fit to the outside of that stone, and this antler is going to get pretty hot, it's going to get toasty, but if you picked that stone up and then you held it over your food, then it could broil your food underneath. But that is not very efficient. You are not going to be able to cook very much at a time, and you're really only toasting the top. So that style of cooking is probably not going to be seen until people have an abundance of time in their day to really try to impress with the way that they are preparing food. So most likely hunter-gatherers are not going to be doing much broiling. And then baking in general is a longer process. It's a little bit more involved in needing to, well, oftentimes knead a dough, but create a dough, and then the oven itself. So even if earth ovens were used, that is still a little bit more of an advanced cooking technique. Roasting over an open fire, definitely doable. Grilling, creating some type of contraption to put over that open fire and place the food on that, possible. That one is kind of in the middle of our, like, what's likely to have been happening in prehistory or not. And then griddling, well, you could call putting food on a hot stone on the fire as like griddling because you have that direct contact with a solid surface. All right, so now we have the wet or moist cooking methods. And that includes poaching, simmering, and boiling, along with steaming and braising. So the difference between poaching, simmering, and boiling is really just how hot the liquid is. Poaching is the most gentle, depending on what altitude you are at. Poaching will be around 160 to 175 degrees Fahrenheit, that water will be. So it's great for delicate foods like eggs or small fish. Simmering is a little bit warmer, about 180 degrees to about 200 degrees. And then boiling is the most. So at sea level, you'll be boiling around 212 degrees. And as you go up in altitude, your water will boil at lower temperatures. So like in the Rocky Mountain region here, you may have boiling water at 200, 205 degrees. So steaming is taking that like boiling liquid and cooking the food in the vapors that come up off of the boil, right, in that steam that is released from the boiling. And then braising is typically in contemporary times used in like a two-step cooking process. So today, oftentimes you'll see it used with meat, and first the meat will be like pan fried or seared around the outside and then put in a dish in the oven in a small amount of liquid and then covered with like aluminum foil. So the meat is being cooked by some of the juices that it is setting in, along with some of the steam that is being created and kept in and around the meat. So you may think, well, that's a little bit more complicated, so that might be one of the least likely to be seen cooking methods in prehistoric times from a moist cooking method standpoint. However, I would say the steaming one is probably the least likely seen because it's not very efficient. And when we're thinking about where cooking started, we're gonna wanna think about the most efficient ways to cook. And we'll get back to that a little bit more later. So in order to braise something, people would have needed to create a type of pot or cooking vessel for the food to be kept in so that there were some juices sitting at the bottom for it to cook. And then they could have covered it in like grape leaves or palm leaf, like just any sort of like pretty big leaf to keep some of that moisture in. So it's possible that braising was happening in prehistoric times. I think that the invention of pottery is pretty important to the realities of people braising food. And then I mentioned this briefly in the last episode, but people could cook with like simmering or boiling water by heating up stones in a fire and then placing those stones in the water, and eventually you'll add enough so that the water gets hot enough to then poach, simmer, or boil your food. Again, it's not going to be quite as efficient as open fire cooking, but it's not unlikely to have been done in hunter-gatherer societies. All right, and our last category of methods of cooking in contemporary kitchens is, cooking with fat. So really frying. And so we have sauteing, pan frying, and deep frying. Sauteing is when you just have a little bit of oil in a pan and you're using a relatively hot temperature, and oftentimes when you saute, you are sauteing thinly sliced foods and moving those around the pan relatively often. In pan frying, you have a little more fat, like an inch or two. That way your food is placed in the oil. However, it doesn't necessarily need to be completely surrounded by the oil. Like the sides will probably be covered in oil, but the top might be sitting up out of that oil. And the food is going to be getting some direct heat from the pan along with the heat from the hot oil around it. Deep frying is submersing that food completely in oil. So that's when you typically need a very large pot so that your food can be completely submerged. In general, this category is the one that is going to not come around for a while. The realities of hunter-gatherers having an abundance of fat to melt and get high, like at a hot enough temperature to cook things in, is not very likely. So even though hunter-gatherers were killing large animals and there was probably a fair amount of fat with that, doesn't mean that they necessarily had enough to start frying other foods in it. It's much more likely that they would have been, consuming that fat along with the meat that it was next to, or utilizing the fat in other ways and not saving it, melting it, and getting it really hot to then be able to fry food. Because to have deliciously fried food, you need this oil to get really hot, and you also need some type of vessel to hold this in. So pottery could be a vessel for this. However, some potteries are going to crack under hot temperatures. So there's really, it would have been a very delicate balance to try to create a pottery that can hold oil that's hot enough to deep fry your food. So along with broiling foods and steaming foods, I think that all three of these cooking with fat cooking techniques would have come later down the line. That is kind of a lot of background and context to even begin starting this conversation. So I hope that you are a culinary nerd and love learning the basics of these types of cooking methods, because I did not really realize I was going to go into so much detail about all of those. But here we are.